The telephone line buzzed with electric tension on that cold December morning in Luxembourg City. General Omar Bradley's fingers wrapped around the receiver like a vice. His knuckles had turned bone white against the dark surface of the phone. The voice, traveling across those crackling wires, belonged to Dwight Eisenhower. Each word arrived measured and deliberate. The Supreme Commander was delivering news that would shake their friendship to its foundation. 2 entire American armies would be transferred. The First Army and the Ninth Army were moving under British control, under Montgomery's direct command. Bradley's Missouri composure finally cracked like ice under pressure. The words exploded from his throat before he could stop them. "By God, Ike," he roared into the receiver. "I cannot be responsible to the American people if you do this thing." The silence stretched between them for heartbeats. Then Bradley delivered his ultimatum. "I resign." Eisenhower's response came back cold as winter steel. "Brad, I am responsible to the American people, not you. Your resignation means absolutely nothing to me." Bradley felt the words hit him like physical blows. He made one final desperate protest. His voice cracked with emotion and frustration. Then he fell silent. The phone line hummed with unspoken tension. This moment would be buried beneath the chaos and confusion of Hitler's Ardennes offensive. But it crystallized 3 long years of mounting American rage. Their anger was directed at one British field marshal who seemed determined to prove something, that he alone possessed the genius to win this war. Bernard Law Montgomery stood as the victor of El Alamein. British newspapers hailed him as the hero of the empire. He had become the most divisive figure in the entire Allied command structure. But one question haunted American headquarters from Tunisia to the German border. It was simple in its phrasing, devastating in its implications. Why did a coalition fighting for survival against Nazi tyranny tear itself apart? The enemy wasn't destroying them from within. The personality of one single man was accomplishing that task. The answer didn't lie in any single dramatic incident. It lived in the accumulation of moments that built like sediment, decisions that stung like paper cuts, clashes that began in North African sand and continued through Northwest European mud. This became the story of military genius transforming into military burden. National pride crashed headlong into Allied necessity. The Americans came to view their most prominent British battlefield commander with emotions that ranged from deep exasperation to something approaching genuine hatred. The mathematics of Allied command appeared deceptively simple on paper. The political reality was infinitely more complex. By late 1944, American forces in Europe had grown to dwarf British troop numbers. The margins were substantial and growing larger each month. American industrial output had completely overwhelmed Britain's war-stretched economy. Factories across the American heartland pumped out weapons, vehicles, and supplies at rates that left British planners gasping. Yet Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery seemed constitutionally incapable of acknowledging these new realities. He refused to adjust his behavior to match the changing balance of power. To American eyes, Montgomery represented everything their ancestors had fought a revolution to escape. Aristocratic presumption oozed from his every gesture. Colonial condescension colored his every interaction. An unshakable belief in British superiority guided his every decision. But Montgomery was no simple caricature drawn from American prejudices. He possessed genuine brilliance that even his enemies acknowledged. His preparation was meticulous to the point of obsession. He demonstrated careful attention to his soldiers' lives in ways that endeared him to British troops. His victories were absolutely real. His tactical knowledge was undeniably sharp. British soldiers had been battered by early war defeats across multiple theaters. In Montgomery, they found a commander who won battles consistently. More importantly, he kept casualty lists manageable when possible. Churchill cherished Montgomery like a favored son. The British public adored him with an intensity that bordered on worship. None of this mattered to American commanders who found themselves repeatedly sidelined. They were patronized in meetings and publicly diminished by a field marshal who seemed to view them as enthusiastic amateurs. These Americans needed British guidance at every turn. Montgomery seemed to believe this guidance was not just helpful, but absolutely essential. The friction began not with grand strategic disputes that historians love to analyze. It started with something far more personal and cutting: respect, or rather, the complete lack thereof. From their first encounters in North African desert heat through the final victory celebrations in Germany, American commanders would make a disturbing discovery. Montgomery's treatment of them revealed deep assumptions about American competence, about American courage, about American fundamental worth as military professionals. These assumptions cut deeper than any battlefield disagreement ever could. The desert wind carried multiple scents across the Tunisian landscape on March 6, 1943. Acrid smoke from burned vehicles mixed with the metallic smell of defeat. Lieutenant General George S. Patton stepped off his transport plane onto foreign soil. He was arriving to assume command of the battered Second Corps. 20 days had passed since the disaster. German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had savagely mauled American units in their first major engagement with veteran Wehrmacht troops. The defeat had been comprehensive in its scope, humiliating in its execution, instructive in ways that no training exercise could match. What greeted Patton was not merely a demoralized command structure, it was a British command system that viewed American forces as fundamentally unreliable auxiliaries. These forces required careful supervision at all times. General Harold Alexander commanded the new British 18th Army Group. This position gave him oversight of all Allied ground forces operating in Tunisia. Alexander had drafted a detailed report on American combat performance that read like a legal indictment. American commanders lacked the experience necessary for modern warfare. American troops lacked the discipline required for sustained combat. American units required extensive British oversight before they could be trusted with any significant responsibilities. The report contained elements of harsh truth. Kasserine Pass had brutally exposed genuine deficiencies in American leadership at multiple levels. American tactical coordination was sloppy. American combined arms integration was virtually non-existent. But Alexander's response went far beyond corrective criticism aimed at improvement. In his professional view, Second Corps should be assigned strictly supporting roles. British forces would execute all primary attacks against the enemy. Patton understood immediately what was truly at stake in the Tunisian desert. This campaign was not merely about defeating Rommel's Afrika Korps. It was about proving that American arms could stand alongside their British counterparts as genuine equals. His diary entries from this period documented British presumption with surgical precision. They also revealed his iron determination to prove American worth through aggressive offensive action. Montgomery commanded the British Eighth Army as it approached Tunisia from the eastern desert. He embodied every British assumption that Patton had grown to resent. The victor of El Alamein carried himself with the supreme confidence of a commander who had single-handedly reversed Britain's fortunes in the desert campaign. He had driven Rommel's forces across the entire breadth of North Africa. His methods emphasized methodical and carefully prepared operations. He preferred overwhelming material superiority to tactical flair or operational artistry. His soldiers trusted him completely because he won battles without wasting their lives unnecessarily. But his entire manner suggested that he alone truly understood the complexities of modern warfare. Everyone else, particularly Americans, had much to learn from his example. Alexander's operational plan for the final Tunisian campaign reflected these fundamental assumptions perfectly. Montgomery's Eighth Army would deliver the primary blow against the Mareth Line. These were the main Axis fortifications in southern Tunisia. Patton's Second Corps would conduct supporting attacks designed to draw German attention away from Montgomery's main effort. The Americans would serve as Montgomery's shield and distraction. The British would earn the glory of breaking through to Tunis. The plan contained solid military logic that was difficult to dispute. Montgomery commanded veteran troops with proven success against German armor in desert conditions. Patton led formations that were still learning their deadly trade. But the allocation of missions carried implications that extended far beyond simple tactical prudence. It established expectations and patterns that would haunt American commanders throughout the entire war. British forces would naturally take the leading role in major operations. American forces would provide essential but secondary support functions. British commanders would receive primary credit for victories. American achievements would go largely unnoticed or systematically minimized in official reporting. Patton launched his offensive toward El Geter on March 17, 1943. He was determined to prove American competence through characteristically aggressive action. His orders reflected his larger-than-life personality perfectly. They mixed specific tactical guidance with passionate demands for aggressive leadership at every level. American officers would lead their men from the front lines. American troops would demonstrate the same aggressive fighting spirit that had characterized their entry into the First World War. Whatever the ultimate cost in blood and treasure, Second Corps would demonstrate conclusively that it deserved treatment as a genuine combat force, not as glorified occupation troops. The Battle of El Geter provided the vindication Patton desperately sought. On March 23rd, 50 German tanks belonging to the 10th Panzer Division emerged from narrow mountain passes into the valley below. They were executing a carefully planned dawn attack designed to shatter American defensive positions completely. What followed next shocked the experienced German commanders to their core. American artillery had been positioned with careful attention to overlapping fields of fire. The guns unleashed devastating concentrations on the advancing German armor. Tank destroyers had been positioned to exploit natural terrain advantages perfectly. They engaged the approaching panzers at ranges that completely negated traditional German tactical superiority. By the day's bloody end, the battlefield was littered with destroyed German vehicles smoking in the desert heat. The 10th Panzer Division had been stopped completely cold in its tracks. For the first time in the war, American forces had defeated experienced German armored units in sustained head-to-head combat. But the victory carried a bitter aftertaste that lingered for weeks. Alexander's headquarters remained focused entirely on Montgomery's operations against the Mareth Line. They paid minimal attention to Second Corps' stunning success. British staff officers continued issuing detailed micromanaging instructions to Patton. Their tone suggested persistent doubts about fundamental American competence. More galling still, Alexander repeatedly changed Second Corps' objectives without consultation. He shifted operational priorities in ways that appeared designed for one purpose: ensuring that American forces remained strictly auxiliary to British operations at all times. Patton would receive orders to advance aggressively, then halt immediately, attack with concentrated armor, then lead with dispersed infantry instead. Each sudden change disrupted carefully planned American operations. Each modification sent a clear signal throughout the command structure. Second Corps existed primarily to facilitate Montgomery's grand plans, not to achieve genuinely independent operational objectives. When Montgomery finally attacked the Meureth Line on March 20th, his initial assault made disappointingly little progress. Determined German resistance had stopped the attack cold. He adapted by shifting his main effort to an ambitious outflanking maneuver. This demonstrated the tactical flexibility that characterized Montgomery's very best operations. But the significant modification required precious time to organize and execute properly. This delay allowed German forces to establish strong new defensive positions. By the time 8th Army finally broke through the enemy lines, the golden opportunity for decisive pursuit had passed completely. Second Corps continued its supporting attacks in the rugged terrain of central Tunisia. American forces steadily drew German reserves away from Montgomery's primary front. American units advanced methodically, taking assigned objectives and inflicting steady casualties on Axis forces. But these substantial achievements went largely unacknowledged in official British reporting. Montgomery's eventual breakthrough received extensive and glowing publicity throughout the Allied world. Patton's contribution, equally important to the overall campaign's ultimate success, merited only minimal mention in dispatches. When the final victory parade was held in conquered Tunis on May 20, 1943, the ceremony told its own story. General Eisenhower stood with Alexander and French General Henri Giraud as they took the formal salute. The official narrative emphasized British and French achievements in sweeping terms. American contributions received cursory acknowledgement that felt almost grudging. For American commanders studying the Tunisian campaign's aftermath, the lessons extended far beyond tactics and logistics. They learned that fighting alongside the British meant fighting constantly for proper recognition that matched their actual contributions to victory. They discovered that Montgomery, whatever his undeniable military talents, seemed constitutionally incapable of treating American forces as genuine operational partners. Instead, he viewed them as promising apprentices who might someday merit real responsibility. They began to suspect that this dismissive attitude reflected something deeper and more troubling, not just Montgomery's individual personality quirks, but a broader British unwillingness to accept fundamental reality. The balance of power within the alliance had shifted irrevocably toward Washington. These hard-learned lessons would prove completely prophetic when the Allies turned their strategic attention to the next major objective on their list. The waters of the Gulf of Gela rolled and pitched under heavy weather as the largest amphibious assault in human history approached Sicily's contested shores. Operation Husky represented the invasion of Italy's largest and most strategic island. The assault commenced in complete darkness and rough seas that challenged every aspect of the complex plan. Over 8 full divisions were divided between 2 major commands for the operation. General Bernard Montgomery led the British 8th Army from the east. General George Patton commanded the American 7th Army from the west. Together they stormed beaches stretching from Cape Scogliti to Syracuse. This was an operation that would test Allied unity as thoroughly as it tested German and Italian defensive capabilities. The planning process for Operation Husky had generated contentious debates from its very inception. Initial proposals had envisioned landings dispersed widely across Sicily's coastline. The goal was seizing multiple ports quickly to ensure adequate supply lines for subsequent inland operations. Montgomery detested dispersed landing operations with passionate intensity. His hard-won experience in North African campaigns had convinced him that concentration of overwhelming force was absolutely paramount. Scattering troops across wide areas invited defeat in detail by concentrated enemy counterattacks. On April 24, 1943, he articulated his strong objections and proposed a radically different alternative approach, Concentrate all Allied landings on Sicily's southeastern corner exclusively. Give 8th Army the clear and unambiguous mission of driving straight north to Messina. This northeastern port city served as the gateway to mainland Italy. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder and Admiral Andrew Cunningham bore responsibility for air and naval operations respectively. Both men opposed Montgomery's revised plan with substantial technical arguments. The concentration would leave 13 Axis airfields fully operational throughout the invasion. This posed unacceptable risks to the vulnerable invasion fleet. It would require Allied ships to remain concentrated in extremely limited waters. This made them sitting ducks for sustained German air attacks. Their professional objections carried considerable weight with Allied planners. Both men commanded deep respect earned through multiple successful operations. Montgomery's response revealed the full intimidating force of his formidable personality. He threatened, with Churchill's explicit backing, to resign his command rather than execute a plan he considered fundamentally flawed from conception. Faced with a leadership crisis that threatened to derail the entire invasion timetable, Eisenhower called an emergency conference for May 2nd. The meeting would resolve this dispute once and for all. The gathering exposed dangerous fault lines that would widen steadily throughout the remaining war. Montgomery presented his case with characteristic confidence that bordered on pure arrogance. Tedder and Cunningham pushed back hard, defending the critical importance of neutralizing airfields and maintaining naval security. Eisenhower found himself attempting to balance genuine military necessities against delicate coalition politics. He ultimately sided with Montgomery's concentrated approach. The landings would focus exclusively on southeastern Sicily. 8th Army would drive toward Messina, while 7th Army protected 8th Army's vulnerable left flank. For Patton, reading the final operational plan in his North African headquarters while preparing his command for the coming invasion, the implications were crystal clear and unmistakable. 7th Army would play a strictly supporting role in the operation. Montgomery would lead the primary attack toward the main objective. The British would take Messina and claim victory, while Americans guarded their flank. Once again, American forces found themselves relegated to secondary missions. British commanders would pursue the glory and recognition that came with decisive victories. The decision rankled for reasons that extended far beyond Patton's considerable personal ego. By July 1943, American forces in the Mediterranean theater had grown substantially in both size and capability. 7th Army now comprised 3 full infantry divisions, 1 complete armored division, and substantial supporting troops. This force was genuinely comparable in size and firepower to Montgomery's 8th Army. American industrial output was flooding Allied stockpiles with state-of-the-art equipment daily. American air power had achieved complete dominance over Mediterranean skies. Yet the command structure continued treating American forces as auxiliaries. They existed to be employed at British discretion for British objectives. Patton's diary entry from July 12th captured his mounting frustration with characteristic brutal clarity. Alexander and his entirely British staff had visited 7th Army headquarters to present the detailed operational plan. A plan that, in Patton's professional view, deliberately cut Americans off from any realistic possibility of taking Messina. He noted with bitter sarcasm that Alexander, supposedly commanding both British and American armies, had arrived with absolutely no American officers on his personal staff. "What fools we are," Patton wrote with savage honesty. He recognized that American political leaders had accepted a command arrangement that absolutely guaranteed American marginalization in every major operation. The actual landings on July 10th went reasonably well overall, despite completely chaotic airborne operations. British and American paratroopers were scattered randomly across the Sicilian countryside. Many drowned tragically when their overloaded gliders crashed directly into the Mediterranean Sea. By dawn, both armies had successfully secured their designated beachheads and were pushing steadily inland against varying resistance. Initial resistance from Italian coastal divisions crumbled almost immediately under sustained pressure. German counterattacks against Gela Beach, where Patton's forces had landed in strength, were defeated decisively. American troops fought with determined courage, supported by devastating naval gunfire from offshore vessels. The 1st Infantry Division demonstrated the fighting qualities that would make it legendary. Montgomery, supremely confident that Axis resistance would collapse quickly before methodical British pressure, signaled Alexander that the route to Messina lay wide open. His 8th Army would drive straight up the eastern coastal road without significant opposition. Patton's 7th Army should hold strictly defensive positions, protecting 8th Army's flank, while Montgomery pursued what he confidently assumed would be a completely demoralized enemy. The signal revealed Montgomery's fundamental assumptions about the campaign with stunning clarity. British forces would deliver the decisive knockout blow to enemy resistance. American forces would provide essential security while remaining safely out of the way. Reality intruded on Montgomery's confident predictions almost immediately. German forces, far from collapsing under pressure, established extremely strong defensive positions. They exploited Sicily's naturally mountainous terrain with professional skill. 8th Army's advance bogged down completely south of Catania. German paratroopers held prepared positions that channeled British attacks into carefully prepared killing zones. Montgomery's methodical approach, so devastatingly effective in open desert warfare, struggled badly against defenders who could concentrate overwhelming forces on narrow fronts. These defenders fought from carefully prepared positions with excellent fields of fire. On July 12th, as 8th Army's advance stalled completely, Montgomery sent a signal to Alexander that would fundamentally define Anglo-American relations for the remainder of the entire war. He proposed that 8th Army should expand its operational area significantly westward. This expansion would effectively commandeer a key road network that had been assigned to 7th Army. The expanded frontage would theoretically allow him to outflank stubborn German positions that were blocking his direct advance toward Messina. American forces should halt all offensive operations and defend statically while 8th Army executed the maneuver that would cut Sicily completely in half. The signal's presumptuous tone was every bit as significant as its actual content. Montgomery was not requesting Alexander's approval for a major operational change. He was informing Alexander of his intentions and suggesting that American forces should adjust their operations accordingly. The presumption was absolutely staggering in its scope. Montgomery was proposing to appropriate American operational areas without consultation. He wanted to relegate American forces to purely static defensive roles. He planned to execute a strategy that would ensure British forces alone gained credit for Sicily's complete conquest. Alexander, whose personal admiration for Montgomery clearly outweighed his confidence in American battlefield commanders, agreed without hesitation. On July 13th, he issued a formal order assigning Montgomery the disputed road network. He instructed Patton to hold defensively while 8th Army advanced toward its objectives. For American commanders reading this order with growing amazement and anger, the message was absolutely unmistakable. British preferences would determine Allied strategy regardless of American contributions or demonstrated capabilities. Patton's initial response demonstrated the severe political constraints that frustrated American commanders throughout the war. Despite his private fury, expressed in diary entries comparing Montgomery to an arrogant prima donna and Alexander to an incompetent sycophant, Patton formally accepted the order without public protest. He understood perfectly that Eisenhower, commanding all Allied forces in the Mediterranean theater, could not afford open revolt by subordinate commanders. Coalition warfare required constant compromise and careful accommodation, even when compromise meant swallowing completely justified anger and resentment. But Patton had absolutely no intention of allowing 7th Army to sit passively idle while Montgomery pursued victory and glory. If Alexander refused to assign Americans a genuinely primary mission, Patton would create one himself through aggressive action. He flew directly to Alexander's headquarters on July the 17th. He carried a detailed map and a carefully prepared proposal that would change everything. Rather than defend passively and uselessly, 7th Army would drive northwest toward Palermo. Sicily's historic capital and principal port city beckoned. The operation would cut the entire island in half, trapping Italian forces in western Sicily. It would secure major port facilities that would dramatically ease American supply difficulties. Alexander, perhaps genuinely surprised by Patton's bold initiative or simply relieved to see American aggression directed safely away from Montgomery's operations, gave his approval. The decision fundamentally altered the entire Sicily campaign in ways that nobody fully anticipated. Rather than a single British advance up the eastern coast, supported by American defensive operations, the Allies would now conduct two completely separate offensive drives. Montgomery would continue pushing methodically toward Messina from the south and east. Patton would race to Palermo, then turn eastward and drive toward Messina along Sicily's northern coastal route. What began as a strategic adjustment rapidly transformed into an intensely personal competition between two strong-willed commanders. Patton, absolutely determined to prove American capabilities and reach Messina before Montgomery, drove his command with characteristic relentless intensity. 7th Army moved with a speed that shocked both allies and enemies alike. They covered extremely rugged terrain at rates Montgomery's methodical approach could never hope to match. Just 12 days after the initial landings, American troops entered Palermo in triumph on July 22nd. They had captured Sicily's largest city and secured a major port facility. Montgomery, meanwhile, continued his careful, grinding advance against determined German defenses south of Mount Etna. His progress was measured, professional, and increasingly irrelevant to the campaign's ultimate outcome. German forces, recognizing clearly that Sicily could not be held indefinitely, had already begun preparing for systematic evacuation to mainland Italy. The question was no longer whether the Allies would conquer Sicily completely. The question had become which Allied army would reach Messina first and claim the symbolic victory. The race to Messina revealed fundamental character differences as much as tactical capabilities. Patton pushed 7th Army to the absolute limits of human endurance. He demanded relentless advance, regardless of natural obstacles or mounting casualties. His corps commanders, thoroughly accustomed to his demanding style, drove their divisions with matching intensity. American engineers repaired damaged roads and bridges with truly remarkable speed. American infantry marched through stifling heat and mountainous terrain at paces that left support units struggling desperately to keep up. Montgomery's 8th Army, facing admittedly stronger opposition on more difficult terrain, continued advancing with characteristic methodical precision. British commanders, trained by experience to minimize casualties and carefully husband increasingly precious resources, refused to risk potential disasters in pursuit of pure speed. The stark contrast illustrated fundamental differences between American and British military cultures that ran deeper than tactical doctrine. Americans, Blessed with vast manpower reserves and virtually unlimited industrial capacity, could afford to accept tactical risks and sustain heavy casualties when necessary. British forces, fighting continuously since 1939, with steadily dwindling manpower and a completely exhausted national economy, simply could not afford such luxuries. But the race was also intensely personal between two commanders who represented their nation's military pride. Montgomery's public statements and private correspondence revealed clearly that he considered Eighth Army's mission far more important and infinitely more difficult than Seventh Army's operations. American success in reaching Palermo, from Montgomery's dismissive perspective, demonstrated absolutely nothing significant about American capabilities. Patton had faced primarily weak Italian opposition across secondary terrain of limited strategic importance. Eighth Army confronted battle-tested German troops in naturally strong positions that heavily favored defensive operations. The comparison Montgomery implied was completely meaningless from any professional standpoint. American commanders saw Montgomery's casual dismissal of their hard-won achievements as absolutely characteristic British condescension. They had heard identical assessments throughout the Tunisian campaign. American successes were systematically minimized or explained away. American difficulties were invariably attributed to inexperience and poor leadership. American commanders were consistently patronized as enthusiastic but fundamentally untutored amateurs. This persistent attitude suggested that British respect for American arms remained purely conditional. It would be extended only when American forces operated under direct British command and control. Only when they fought for explicitly British strategic objectives would their contributions receive proper recognition. On August 17, 1943, advance elements of Patton's 3rd Infantry Division entered the port city of Messina several hours before British forces finally arrived. Seventh Army had decisively won the symbolic race across Sicily, but the victory felt hollow in ways that perfectly reflected the toxic state of Allied command relationships. Montgomery's public reaction combined surface graciousness with subtle but unmistakable dismissal of American achievements. He congratulated Patton while heavily emphasizing the superior difficulties that Eighth Army had faced throughout the campaign. He strongly implied that favorable terrain rather than genuine military competence explained the different outcomes. British press coverage reflected Montgomery's careful framing of events perfectly. Reports celebrated Eighth Army's heroic fighting against veteran German forces while treating Seventh Army's rapid advance as an interesting sideshow against clearly inferior opposition. American achievements received grudging acknowledgement, but were systematically diminished in importance. They were presented as merely complementary to rather than equal with British operational success. For American commanders reading these accounts with mounting frustration, the message was absolutely unmistakable. British narratives would always center British achievements regardless of objective evidence or documented facts. The Sicily campaign left deep scars in the Allied command structure that would never fully heal. American commanders had demonstrated conclusively that their forces could match British troops in operational tempo and combat effectiveness under identical conditions. But recognition from their British counterparts remained grudging and heavily conditional. Montgomery, in particular, seemed constitutionally incapable of acknowledging that American commanders might possess military skills genuinely comparable to his own, or that American forces might deserve credit and recognition commensurate with their substantial contributions to Allied victory. The Allied breakout from Normandy had completely shattered German defensive positions throughout France. Wehrmacht forces were reeling eastward in what appeared to be headlong retreat. Paris had been liberated amid jubilant scenes on August 25, 1944. The celebrations seemed to confirm what many believed. The war's end was imminent. From the blood-soaked Normandy beaches to the Belgian border, Allied armies pursued apparently defeated enemies across terrain where German forces had seemed unbeatable just months earlier. Victory, perhaps by Christmas of 1944, appeared to be within their grasp at last. For Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, recently promoted and basking in the reflected glory of Normandy's stunning success, this moment demanded nothing less than bold, decisive action. The weight of command pressed heavily on his shoulders that September morning. He controlled every Allied ground force that had stormed the beaches of Normandy. His earlier triumphs across North African deserts and Sicilian hills had carved his reputation in stone. Britain hailed him as their greatest battlefield commander since Wellington himself. German armies scattered before him like leaves in autumn wind. Victory seemed within reach. One decisive strike might end this terrible war. But September 1st brought unwelcome news that set his jaw tight with barely controlled rage. Eisenhower was taking over. The Supreme Allied Commander would now personally direct all ground operations. The Field Marshal who had orchestrated the liberation of France found himself stripped of American divisions. His authority shrank to commanding 21st Army Group alone. British forces, Canadian troops. That was all. Across the battlefield, Bradley would lead American armies. The 1st Army, the 3rd Army, the 9th Army, all beyond his reach now. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. American boots outnumbered British and Canadian soldiers by massive margins. American trucks carried supplies to the front. American factories filled ammunition depots. American bombers ruled European skies. American industrial might powered Allied victory. Political reality demanded recognition of these facts. Command must reflect contribution. The Field Marshal grasped the politics perfectly. Understanding did not equal acceptance. This dispersal of authority violated every principle of effective leadership. Multiple commanders meant confused objectives. Divided responsibility guaranteed diluted results. Victory required concentrated command under a single decisive leader. Eisenhower possessed political skills. Nobody questioned his diplomacy. But battlefield experience? Combat leadership? The Supreme Commander had never directed armies under fire. His talents lay in managing alliances, not winning battles. Strategic coordination should remain Eisenhower's role. Keep the politicians happy. Manage the logistics. Handle the press conferences. But operational command belonged in experienced hands. Someone who understood warfare at the deepest level. Someone with proven battlefield credentials. The proposal had obvious beneficiaries, yet the Field Marshal presented his case as military necessity, not personal ambition. Eisenhower's broad front strategy appalled him completely. Advancing into Germany with multiple armies attacking simultaneously was strategically bankrupt. Resources scattered across hundreds of miles. No decisive concentration anywhere. No knockout punch. The war would drag through winter into 1945. Casualties would mount. Victory would come eventually. But at what cost? His alternative burned bright with possibility and risk. Concentrate everything for one massive thrust northward. Cross the Rhine in overwhelming strength. Seize the industrial heartland. Drive straight to Berlin before German defenses could solidify. Speed and audacity would triumph where caution failed. American forces could provide flank protection. British spearheads would deliver the decisive blow. Military experts could debate the plan's merits endlessly. A narrow thrust created vulnerabilities. German forces might counterattack the exposed flanks. Supply lines would stretch across contested territory. Success depended on capturing bridges intact. Everything hinged on German resistance collapsing completely. These risks were real and substantial, but political implications were unmistakable and inflammatory. American political leaders must subordinate their armies to British command. American soldiers would serve as shields while British forces claimed final victory. The field marshal demanded operational control from a supreme commander he openly scorned. American blood would purchase British glory. The proposal was audacious. It was also politically toxic. Eisenhower sought compromise between military necessity and coalition politics. No concentration for the northern thrust, but priority for supplies would flow northward. A limited operation could seize Dutch bridges. Market Garden would employ 3 airborne divisions: Eindhoven, Nijmegen, Arnhem. Paratroopers would capture bridges before German engineers destroyed them. British ground forces would race across captured spans, establish bridgeheads beyond the Rhine, position themselves for final operations into Germany. American commanders reacted with predictable fury. Bradley and Patton saw the scheme clearly. Another British attempt to relegate American forces to supporting roles. British troops would pursue glory, while Americans provided muscle. Supplies desperately needed elsewhere would resource this questionable adventure. The risks seemed wildly disproportionate to potential gains. Patton's Third Army was driving through eastern France at breakneck pace. His tanks approached the German border. The Rhine lay within reach, yet fuel allocations were shifting northward to support British operations. American forces demonstrated superior speed and aggression throughout August. Their advances covered more ground than methodical British movements. Third Army proved that bold American operations achieved better results than cautious British planning. Bradley normally displayed diplomatic restraint, but frustration boiled over as he watched resources flow northward. The field marshal demanded supplies, threatened catastrophe if denied, received priority regardless of American achievements. Coalition politics guaranteed sympathetic hearings for British demands. American forces provided most of the combat power. British commanders received most of the consideration. September 17th dawned clear over Dutch farmland. Operation Market Garden commenced with unprecedented airborne assault. Over 35,000 paratroopers descended from transport aircraft. British soldiers, American airborne divisions, all tasked with seizing bridges before German demolition teams could destroy them. Ground forces began racing northward along a single highway. XXX Corps led the advance. Their mission was simple: relieve airborne units before German counterattacks overwhelmed them. The operation collapsed within hours of beginning. Intelligence had detected German armor near Arnhem. SS Panzer Divisions were refitting in the area. These warnings were dismissed as exaggerated. Airborne forces landed miles from their objectives. German resistance crystallized rapidly. The single highway became a killing ground. British armor could not maneuver off roads bordered by marshland. Traffic jams created perfect targets. German resistance intensified rather than collapsing. Wehrmacht commanders recognized the threat immediately. Reinforcements rushed toward the battle. At Arnhem Bridge, British paratroopers under Lieutenant Colonel Frost held one end against overwhelming odds. They fought for days. Relief never came. XXX Corps stalled against determined counterattacks. Destroyed bridges blocked their advance. Time ran out on the desperate defenders. September 25th brought the bitter end. Operation abandoned. Over 17,000 Allied casualties littered Dutch fields. 6,400 paratroopers who dropped at Arnhem were dead or captured. The failure was complete and catastrophic. The Rhine remained uncrossed. German defenses in the Netherlands solidified into impregnable positions. Allied momentum dissipated in muddy Dutch polders. The opportunity to end the war in 1944 vanished forever. This was the Field Marshal's most devastating mistake. American reactions combined vindication with white-hot anger. Patton and Bradley had opposed Market Garden from the beginning. They argued that risks outweighed potential benefits. Resources would be better employed continuing American advances toward Germany. Their objections were dismissed. Political necessities overruled military judgment. The Field Marshal's certainty silenced doubt. Now failure was undeniable. American commanders felt entitled to satisfaction. Events had confirmed their judgment completely. But satisfaction drowned in fury at the Field Marshal's response. Rather than accepting responsibility for disaster, he proclaimed Market Garden 90% successful. Eindhoven and Nijmegen bridges were captured. Allied forces liberated substantial Dutch territory. That Arnhem remained in German hands was merely a minor setback. The claim was breathtaking in its dishonesty. Market Garden's purpose was establishing bridgeheads over the Rhine. This was not achieved. 17,000 casualties purchased no strategic gain. Yet the Field Marshal declared victory. He rewrote failure as triumph through sheer force of personality. American commanders recognized this maneuver perfectly. When operations succeeded, credit belonged to him alone. When operations failed, blame lay elsewhere. Inadequate resources, insufficient support, others' failures. Personal responsibility never appeared in his narrative. But worse was coming. As Allied operations transitioned to grinding advances against strengthened German defenses, the Field Marshal began publicly criticizing Eisenhower's strategy. Comments to British press grew increasingly pointed. Signals to Churchill became more strident. The broad front approach had squandered opportunities for decisive victory. Had his plan been adopted fully, the war would be over. The critique ignored inconvenient realities. Market Garden had received substantial resources. The operation failed due to flawed planning, intelligence mistakes, underestimating German capabilities, not inadequate support. But the Field Marshal's narrative transformed operational incompetence into missed opportunity. Strategic short-sightedness by others prevented victory. American commanders recognized this pattern clearly. The Field Marshal would never acknowledge personal error. Every setback became someone else's failure. Every success was his triumph. This suggested more than vanity. It revealed fundamental incapacity for honest self-assessment. Such traits made him dangerous to Allied unity, despite his tactical abilities. December 16th brought winter winds and desperate German gambles. The Ardennes forest erupted with artillery fire at dawn. German forces launched their final offensive in the west. 3 armies smashed into thinly held American positions. The assault achieved complete surprise. Allied lines bulged backward under massive pressure. German spearheads drove toward the Meuse River. The port of Antwerp beckoned beyond. Victory or decisive defeat hung in the balance. For 10 days, the outcome remained uncertain. German tanks penetrated deep into Allied rear areas. Communication lines snapped. Command structures fractured. American units fought isolated battles against overwhelming odds. The 101st Airborne held Bastogne against repeated assaults. Patton's Third Army pivoted 90 degrees in winter conditions. Counterattacks began from the south. December 20th brought command changes. Eisenhower transferred American 1st and 9th Armies to the Field Marshal's control. The decision made tactical sense. British reserves could defend Meuse crossings. Unified command would coordinate defensive operations. The Field Marshal responded brilliantly to genuine crisis. He positioned reserves effectively, coordinated American counterattacks skillfully, demonstrated why Britain valued his leadership, but his conduct after victory showed the worst aspects of his character. January 7th brought press conference that ignited firestorm. Ostensibly intended to praise American troops and defend Eisenhower, it became masterclass in self-promotion disguised as gracious compliment. The Field Marshal began by acknowledging American soldiers' fighting qualities. Then he pivoted to describing his own decisive actions. "As soon as I saw what was happening," he explained to assembled reporters, "I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over that river." He continued describing how he had tidied up the battlefield, how he had thought ahead, how he had ensured balanced dispositions. The battle was most interesting, possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles he had ever handled. Throughout this recitation, British actions were highlighted, his brilliance emphasized. American commanders remained conspicuously absent from the narrative. The performance was calculated insult disguised as compliment. American soldiers received praise while their commanders were dismissed. American courage was credited while American leadership was ignored. A desperate defensive battle fought primarily by American units became a British triumph. American reaction was explosive and immediate. Bradley felt profound betrayal reading press reports. The Field Marshal had commanded 2 American armies for barely 3 weeks. Those armies fought magnificently against overwhelming odds. German offensive momentum exhausted itself against American resistance. Patton's rapid counterattack from the south was tactically brilliant. American soldiers paid in blood to defeat Hitler's final gamble. Yet the Field Marshal's narrative minimized American contributions. His own role received central importance. This was not merely vanity, it was historical theft, an attempt to rewrite American victory as British rescue. American commanders recognized this as the Field Marshal's authentic view. He genuinely believed his intervention had saved American forces. Nothing inappropriate existed in claiming credit for battles won by troops he commanded less than a month. The press conference triggered command crisis. Bradley called Eisenhower in fury beyond diplomatic constraint. He could not serve under the Field Marshal permanently. If Eisenhower intended permanent command arrangements favoring British leadership, Bradley would resign. The ultimatum was serious. Bradley normally displayed diplomatic skill above all American commanders. His breaking point meant alliance collapse was possible. Eisenhower recognized the danger immediately. He attempted calming Bradley while privately drafting messages to combined chiefs of staff. The message stated plainly that he would request the Field Marshal's relief unless apologies were forthcoming. Public criticisms must cease. The war was won. Whether the alliance survived victory remained uncertain. Crisis was resolved through intense British pressure. The Field Marshal recognized his error belatedly. January 12th brought conciliatory letter to Eisenhower expressing regret. The press conference had caused offense unintentionally. To Bradley came gracious letter praising American troops, expressing gratitude for the honor of commanding them temporarily. The letters appeared sincere. They were largely irrelevant. Damage was done permanently. American commanders understood with absolute clarity that the Field Marshal would never view them as genuine partners. Every operation would be filtered through his reputation's requirements. Every failure would be explained by others' errors. Every success would validate his wisdom. This pattern was fixed and intolerable. More than personality clashes were involved. By early 1945, force balances had shifted decisively toward American predominance. The field marshal's pretensions to battlefield supremacy had become operationally counterproductive. American armies comprised over 60 divisions. British and Canadian forces numbered fewer than 20. American logistics sustained Allied operations. American air power dominated European skies. Yet the field marshal continued behaving as though British wisdom must guide American strength. The contradiction reflected broader tensions in Anglo-American relations. Britain, exhausted by 5 years of war, faced post-war economic collapse. Accepting that global predominance had ended proved difficult. The United States emerged as the world's dominant power. Military might created political responsibilities that American traditions never prepared them to assume. The field marshal's inability to adjust made him a symbol of Britain's difficulty accepting diminished status. Churchill, watching the press conference disaster unfold, recognized the danger immediately. He spoke in Parliament on January 18th. Words were carefully calibrated to repair Allied relationships. The Battle of the Bulge was predominantly an American battle, an American victory. It would be remembered as ever-famous American triumph. British forces played supporting roles as coalition partners should. The speech was diplomatic necessity, correcting the field marshal's narrative, acknowledging military realities. But it also represented Britain's acceptance that remaining campaigns would be primarily American endeavors. British forces would participate and contribute. American commanders would increasingly dictate strategy and claim credit their predominance merited. The field marshal found himself isolated by his own conduct. Increasingly irrelevant to operations dominated by American armies, he spent the war's final months commanding 21st Army Group in Northern Europe. His operations remained professional. Tactical sense stayed sound. But relationships with American commanders never recovered. Bradley avoided him. Patton despised him. Eisenhower tolerated him as political necessity, demanded, but never again trusted his judgment or motives. May 8th brought unconditional German surrender. The European war was over. Victory belonged to Allied coalition that overcame Nazi Germany and internal divisions. Conflicts that repeatedly threatened to tear the alliance apart were temporarily submerged in euphoria of peace. The field marshal received accolades from grateful British public. American commanders returned home to celebrations recognizing their achievements. But memoirs and histories written after the war resurfaced old conflicts. The field marshal's published recollections appearing in 1958 reignited controversies by criticizing Eisenhower, implicitly claiming his strategic vision had been superior. Eisenhower, then President of the United States, broke off personal contact. He refused corresponding with former colleague determined to refight battles from a vanished war. Bradley's memoir, published in 1951, meticulously documented instances where the field marshal's conduct undermined Allied operations. Patton's posthumously published diary revealed the depth of his contempt for the British field marshal. American histories drawing on these accounts presented him as talented but difficult, brilliant but insufferable, a commander whose contributions were real, but whose personality made him a liability to coalition warfare. British historians defended their champion vigorously. American commanders never appreciated his methodical approach, his concern for casualties, his strategic sophistication. He never lost a major battle after assuming command in North Africa. His planning made D-Day successful. American criticisms reflected jealousy of British professionalism and resentment of British military traditions. Debate continued decades after participants' deaths. Historians argued about true contributions, whether American frustrations were justified, how personalities affected military operations. Some concluded he was a great commander, poorly suited to coalition warfare. Others suggested American commanders lacking his experience resented superior judgment. Still others argued conflicts reflected inevitable tensions when proud nations cooperate in existential struggle. Beneath historiographical debates lay simpler truth. One American commanders of World War II understood with crystalline clarity. The field marshal could not treat American forces as equals. Whether this incapacity reflected personal arrogance, cultural prejudice, or British determination to maintain fading supremacy remained debatable. What was indisputable was that his conduct poisoned Allied relationships and created unnecessary obstacles to coalition warfare. The American experience provided lessons outliving the war. Future coalition operations would be structured, preventing personality conflicts from undermining military effectiveness. Command arrangements would ensure proportional representation. No nation could dominate through superior confidence or historical precedent alone. American military culture internalized wariness of allies who confused partnership with subordination. For Americans who fought alongside him from Tunisia to Germany, the field marshal represented what they believed they had left behind in 1776, the assumption that British wisdom must guide American strength. That colonial enthusiasm required metropolitan sophistication to succeed. That New World energy needed Old World experience to avoid disaster. They discovered battlefield excellence, industrial might, and military success could not overcome cultural assumptions rooted in centuries of British global dominance. The field marshal never understood this fundamental truth. To his death in 1976, he maintained his wartime conduct had been appropriate, his criticisms justified, his strategic vision superior to alternatives. He remained convinced Eisenhower's leadership was inadequate. American commanders lacked his professional competence. The war could have ended sooner had his advice been followed. American commanders who survived him offered different verdicts. They acknowledged his tactical skills, but questioned strategic judgment. They praised careful preparation, but noted wars are won by boldness as well as caution. They conceded concern for casualties, but observed that his caution sometimes allowed enemies to escape destruction. They concluded with near unanimity that his personality made coalition warfare more difficult than necessary. Final assessment belonged to Eisenhower, writing years after the war. He acknowledged abilities but noted complete inability to understand political dimensions of coalition command. The field marshal was a man whose military talents were undeniable, but lack of diplomatic sensitivity made him unsuited for senior command in Allied operations. It was perhaps the most devastating critique possible. Not that he lacked military competence, but that virtues were overwhelmed by vices undermining the very cause he served. In coalition warfare, personality affects effectiveness as profoundly as tactics or strategy. His incapacity for treating allies as partners made him not merely difficult, but dangerous. Americans learned this lesson through bitter experience, from North African sand to German mud. They discovered military alliances require more than shared enemies. They demand mutual respect, acknowledgement of partners' contributions, willingness to subordinate ego to collective purpose. The field marshal could not meet these requirements despite his other qualities. In that failure lay the answer to why Americans hated him. Not because he was British, not because he was cautious, but because he made them feel like colonial auxiliaries in a war they were winning. Soldiers whose blood mattered, but whose judgment did not. Allies valued only insofar as they facilitated British glory. That memory outlasted the field marshal, outlasted the generation that served with him, outlasted even the Cold War alliance that grew from wartime cooperation. It served as permanent reminder that technical excellence cannot substitute for human respect. Battlefield brilliance means little if it alienates those whose cooperation victory requires. He was many things: brilliant tactician, careful commander, British hero. But to Americans who fought alongside him, he was also cautionary tale about limits of military genius divorced from diplomatic wisdom. The question was never whether Americans recognized his talents. They did. The question was whether he could recognize theirs. He could not. In that failure of imagination lay roots of bitterness that no amount of shared victory could overcome.